And so now we will continue with the next part of our session on innovations in management. And we have Michael Cusumano, Sloan Management Review Distinguished Professor of Management. And we have his talk, The Business of Platforms, Strategy in the Age of Digital Competition, Innovation, and Power. And it summarizes some key findings from a new book he co-wrote with Annabelle Gower and David Yoffie. So now over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Jose. Hopefully everyone can see me and hear me. So I know we don't have a lot of time, so let me share my screen. And in some ways, we're working backwards here because Luis's presentation is really about how we deal with platforms. Every one of the platforms that I talk about and have been studying for about 30 years, actually, they all use today artificial intelligence or machine learning in one form or another. So I'll talk a little bit about those issues as we go along. So again, this is a book co-authored with a former doctoral student and a colleague at Harvard, Annabelle Gower and David Yoffie. And we have all been working on platforms since the early 1990s, and myself even in the later 1980s. So we've tried to bring together what we've learned about these businesses. And again, my perspective is from the business side. So I'm going to just give you a few of the highlights from how we think about platforms, the winner take all or most dynamics, and then some things about strategy and business models. Now, other things we do talk about in the book are common mistakes of platform ventures, how old dogs, essentially old economy companies can compete with modern platforms. We also have a double-edged swords chapter, and that is similar to some of the issues that Luis talked about, that these platform companies, particularly when they move to win large shares of markets, can certainly abuse those positions. They can abuse customer data. They can harm competitors, suppliers, complementers. They can also do a lot of good in the world. Everyone today is basically living in a digital platform environment since the coronavirus. So again, this presents tremendous opportunities for these platform companies, but someone needs to watch them and to make sure they're not abusing their positions. With a few minutes left at the end, I'll talk about platforms in the future, and that does, and that chapter in the book does get into the use of AI and machine learning in different new types of platforms that we see out. But again, even the older platforms are still using these technologies for matching users with advertisers or search results, for example. Okay, so first point to think about is platforms are everywhere. And this has been true in the digital age. It's also been true before the digital age. We start out the winner take all or most chapter talking about the telephone and the yellow pages, which were introduced around 1880. So we've had this notion of certain technologies that take on very central roles in the economy for quite a long time. And again, I've been studying this beginning with mainframe computers, even going before platforms of the personal computer, but then another book called Microsoft Secrets in 1995, a book, Platform Leadership in 2002, Competing on Internet Time in 1998. These were all dealing with personal computers and the internet as new types of platforms. And later on, of course, we've had smartphones, and interspersed in these, we have social media and sharing economy platforms, payment systems, now more recently, Internet of Things. And we have platforms almost everywhere if you think about high technology. And these platforms work with other platforms or on top of other platforms. Sometimes they displace earlier platforms. So we really do live in a world of platforms, and it makes a lot of sense for managers and entrepreneurs as well as users to understand how these platforms work as well as where they're going. So one distinction we do like to make is between what we call company-controlled internal platforms and these modern industry level or ecosystem level platforms that have become the topic of so much concern and even regulation. So we have been using the term platform in operations management and technology management also for about 30 years, maybe longer. And that's represented by this hierarchy you see on the left-hand side. In the automobile industry, for example, I wrote a book in 1998 talking about how automakers were using reusable subsystems and components, in other words, in-house platforms, to build multiple models off of these reusable components. So these are reusable components or building blocks. The control over those building blocks or access to them is usually within the firm's engineering groups or key suppliers. And so the way platforms evolved for creating new technology in the traditional economy was largely through contracts between the original equipment manufacturer, their key suppliers, and then suppliers to those suppliers and suppliers to those suppliers. And it's really this hierarchy of contracts. So the company at the top of the pyramid, Toyota, General Motors, for example, they're controlling that innovation process through these contracts. But what we started to see, principally with the personal computer, was a different type of innovation. Today we call it open innovation, but it's where we have some technology or product in the middle, and this could be an operating system sitting on top of a microprocessor for either a PC or a smartphone today. And then we have other companies. You still have some suppliers building components for those products. But more than that, you have essentially open programming interfaces or application programming interfaces that different companies can access and build their own products and services. This is what we call complementers. And there's other partners that come in. So rather than this hierarchy of, let's say, contracts among suppliers to an OEM, we really have this more nebulous global ecosystem of potential innovation. By the way, the innovation can be on the, it's primarily on the supply side, like supplying different applications that work on Windows or Android. But also, this has come to be used in a different way, where we have suppliers like drivers for Uber cars as part of this nebulous ecosystem that can expand around the whole globe without being controlled by contracts. And you have millions and even billions of participants, including customers. And there's no way companies could control all this by contracts. So it's a different type of phenomenon than we have seen in the traditional hierarchical economy. So what do we mean by an industry platform? So it does go back to a traditional product, which has building blocks, but these building blocks are extended to the broader world and not controlled just through contracts. So it's a foundation that many firms can use to create or sell their own, what we call complementary products and services. And the more of these complements we have, the more valuable the platform or that central technology becomes. And this is where we get the term network effects. And essentially this network of complementers generate this effect of increasing value. And again, we see not only third-party innovations, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but we see transactions occurring that would not otherwise occur. This would occur with a search engine matched to advertisers, or drivers to riders, or home renters to people that want to rent those apartments or rooms or homes. And the platform enables these transactions or these innovations. And that's the way we break down the world. Just a quick word about network effects. It's a term used fairly frequently. It has been written about in the economics literature, actually going back to right around 1910, when AT&T used the term to justify raising prices to urban users of its telephone network to subsidize rural users as it built out the network of the telephone, arguing that the bigger the network, everyone would benefit from more nodes of connection. And so some people should pay more to enable that broader network value. One of the, so we can call this a self-reinforcing positive feedback loop, where again, at least the potential value each user experiences increases with each additional user where we've come to also add complementers in terms of third-party products and services. Now, the growth potential of a network is essentially geometric or exponential. It's not linear. It's not additive, 1 + 1 + 1. And that's what has made platforms so powerful. And this is a wonderful phenomenon if you can access it as a manager or a company, but it's really not so easy to create. And we associate it today with the internet age, but we've seen them, as I mentioned before, with the telephone, also railroads, making track gauges compatible, creating a network effect for all the railroads. We've seen them with credit cards as well, or fax machines. And some of these were analog technologies or physical technologies, not exactly digital technologies. So again, the idea of network effects have been with us for a while. The telephone really kicked it off, and Robert Metcalfe, a colleague here at the MIT Harvard community, produced his Metcalfe's law, showing the geometric or exponential value of different nodes in a network. And the valuation of companies like Facebook is very much associated with this kind of a network effect, right? The more nodes you have, so very quickly you get into billions of potential connections across these people. And that's great for advertisers, or great for companies that want to diffuse innovations of their own. Okay, so I've already talked about different kinds of platforms, and I will get to our typology in a moment. But all of these industry platforms, whether they're encouraging third-party firms to create products that run on top of Windows or Android or the iPhone, or whether they're matching drivers with riders, they have three things in common. And again, my colleagues and I, we've thought about this for 30 years, and we've tried to simplify this. So first, we use the term industry platforms when we have some entity or product in the middle, or service mechanism in the middle, bringing together two or more market sides. And I'll give you some examples of that. Second, the real value that that platform creates, it does come from the product or the service that's originally offered, but it really comes from the network effects that matching or bringing those multiple sides together can create. And when you have the same side connecting with other users on that same side, like a telephone, we call that direct or same side network effects. But we also have indirect or cross-side network effects. And that's when users are connected to innovators, like producers of apps, or users are connected to advertisers, or users are connected to content owners. And so those network effects can be equally powerful. And then third, to really get a platform going, they have to solve a chicken or egg problem. And this is a term we use every day, but it's also a technical phrase in economics. You have to get started. Those network effects need to begin somewhere, and that's usually the critical problem for platform entrepreneurs and managers. But what we end up with is a pretty complex set of business models and market dynamics in the platform world, and that's why we treat it separately. Our traditional ways of thinking about strategy and market structure don't really fit when companies are not directly selling a product. They're selling something that depends on a second market side trying to reach another side. Okay, and it is very much like playing three-dimensional chess. So here's our typology. Now, we've thought about platforms. We've studied hundreds of them. We actually collected data on the largest platforms and went back 20 years. And I'll explain that data briefly. But we decided that all platforms really can be divided into two types. And if you look across what people say about platforms, they talk about operating systems, microprocessors, publishing platforms, social media, then the list goes on and on, a dozen or more different types. But we think there's really only two types. The first type, and this is the one I originally wrote about in 1995 with Microsoft Secrets and then platform leadership and competing on internet time. Today, we're going to call them innovation platforms. And that is a term we used in our 2002 book. And largely, this is where those building blocks that in the prior old world would be open only to engineering groups or suppliers within a company are opened up to outside firms to create their own applications that utilize those building blocks or services, the APIs. So we have, of course, Windows was the first one, but in the modern world of the cloud today, Microsoft Azure or Microsoft Cloud, we have Facebook for developers. Facebook has enabled about 10 million applications and websites to access data that it has internally, or WeChat API. So these are a whole range of different innovation platforms. And what I have up here is just a sample of them. This is not a complete list of them by any means. Then on the left-hand side, we have platforms that are bringing together two or more market sides, generating network effects, creating a lot of value for users, the more usage of the platform we have. But essentially what they're focused on are exchanges of information or transactions of different sorts. So they're not actually encouraging third-party innovations, but they're encouraging third parties to be what used to be, let's say, suppliers. So instead of hotels, you might have Airbnb, and you're populating a side of people with rooms to rent and another side of people that want to rent those rooms. App stores for example, from Apple or Google Play or Windows Store, these are also transaction platforms. They're creating a distribution mechanism for those innovators, those third-party innovators on the innovation platform side. So actually, these platforms can be linked. And so we see in the middle here what we call hybrid companies that are actually doing both types of platforms or linking both types of platforms. Apple, Google, Microsoft, the most prominent ones, Salesforce, Facebook, Tencent, or Amazon. Amazon has a number of platforms. For example, it started as an online store, but it really became a platform when it opened up Amazon Marketplace around 1999 and 2000, which was bringing together third-party sellers with buyers. When Amazon was just buying and reselling books or electronic goods, it was really just an online store. But it created that one-sided value, and then it expanded with the transaction platform. Then it added an innovation platform, which is Amazon Web Services, which allows people to build applications in an environment that Amazon provides as a service. So there's many of these two different types of platforms. And again, this is just a sample, but the ones in the middle are really quite powerful. So we see also that the most valuable companies in the world are actually hybrid platform companies. This data was from April, but Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, Tencent, the first trillion-dollar companies are also this type. We also find that about 60 to 70% of the unicorns, the billion-dollar private companies, are also platforms of one form or another. They're very popular among entrepreneurs as well. So we're living in a world of platform entrepreneurship, you might say. And the payoffs, if you end up at the top of the successful platform, are enormous. So that's another thing that we did in this book that really had not been done before. We tried to identify publicly listed platforms that emerged with the personal computer, internet services, and the smartphone. And we compared them to a control sample of firms in exactly the same businesses that were not platforms, that were selling either products or services that were standalone, rather than depending on multiple market sides and network effects. So what we actually found, and we did find that there's not that many of these platforms, at least from the PC, internet, and smartphone world. We only found 43 among the top 2,000 Forbes global companies, and we started this database in 2015. Again, this is not including the private companies. If we did it today in 2020, we would probably find twice this number. But here's the bottom line. The platform companies and the non-platform companies in this sample of already successful public companies, they each had about $4.5 billion in annual revenues. So these are already big, successful companies. However, the platform companies generated this revenue with about half the number of employees. They also had twice the sales growth rates year to year. They had almost 2 times the operating profits and almost 3 times the market values. And again, you can understand why. They're generating all these revenues utilizing outside innovation or outside employees, or not having the assets within their company, right? So, you know, they're not building hotels and renting hotels. They're just matching people that want access to these types of rooms, for example. So we also found that the failure rates are reasonably high. We identified 209 failures amongst these 43 companies. But let me see. All right, let me see. Is there a, I can see there's a bar on the top of the slide that people want me to try to remove. Let's see. If I can hide floating panel controls. And let me see. There we go. All right, sorry about that. I finally saw that chat. So what I was saying is we've also identified quite a lot of failures, 209 companies that tried to do this and failed. So the success rate is about 17%. There's also a mix between whether these companies are succeeding because of platform network effects or a very strong product or service. So you can ask that question about Apple and the iPhone. Is the iPhone successful because it has such a great design, was an early mover, or is it because of the 2 million applications that you can access through the iPhone? So it's a combination of the two. And so we're not saying that you can just roll out a platform and be successful. In many cases, you have to have a successful platform first. So here's our basic argument, that in the product business, if you are making something like a cell phone, and here's an example, BlackBerry didn't understand this or didn't understand it soon enough, but if you can add value or potentially significant value by connecting your product users to third-party complementary innovations made by outside firms, then try an innovation platform. And by the way, when a market becomes platformized, like the smartphone market did, initially it wasn't, it was more standalone devices. But then you have to compete as a platform, otherwise you're going to fail. If you're doing a service business, you may conclude that it's more profitable to connect market size rather than to resell goods or deliver services yourself. In that case, then try a transaction platform. So Amazon at the beginning wanted to just buy and resell books, then expanded to electronics and then many other products. But ultimately it realized it's actually more profitable in most cases, not all cases, but just to collect the transaction fee. And so today about 60% of Amazon's retail revenues come from Amazon Marketplace, where it doesn't buy or sell or inventory anything. It's just matching buyers and sellers. So managers and entrepreneurs have to make this decision. The hotel industry as well may be changed on this same type of calculation. So again, if the market moves towards platform competition, then if you're an old dog in that industry, you need to figure out how to respond. Okay, and it's usually the best platform that wins, not the best product. And I first realized this back in the 1980s when I was studying VHS versus Betamax of Sony. And why did VHS win when Betamax was backed by Sony and came out a year earlier? It technically had a better product. It was because VHS had an open licensing strategy, had 30, 40 companies behind it, and they lined up all the Hollywood movie producers to make pre-recorded tapes. So that third-party complement is really what destroyed Betamax. I also became obsessed with this. You can say when Apple introduced the Macintosh in 1984, which was a far better product than the Windows or the DOS and then the Windows compatible personal computers, but the Mac market share collapsed to about 2% because there wasn't enough software. It really was not an open product. It was twice as expensive as IBM compatible machines. And it's, again, Bill Gates and Microsoft understood what a platform was and realized that he could win with a platform strategy. Steve Jobs tried to really just try to introduce the best product and win with the product, but the market had become platformized, which means in this case, the winner really needed these third-party innovations, the innovation ecosystem. And in other cases, like a transaction platform or a marketplace, the winners will have a lot of users and a lot of sellers. So you need to populate those two sides in large numbers. So we get to this framework of winner take all or most, and we've had a lot of these discussions, even going back to the late 1990s over the Microsoft antitrust trial. David Yaffe, my co-author, and I were directly involved in that trial as well. That's another story, but if you win all or most of a market, you become much more liable to charges of antitrust violation. So there's a lot of slippery ground that these platforms go into. And we talk about that in the double-edged sword chapter, but the dynamics look something like this. First, to win all or most of a market, you need to have very strong network effects. They could be direct or indirect. And this is new. In traditional economics and management, we don't think about network effects. Second, something that we call multi-homing needs to be costly, so that users or complementers choose one platform as their home and pretty much stay there. And this is also new in platform thinking. So I can ask you this question: how many of you use both an Apple PC and a Windows PC? You know, generally you do one because it's costly to have both. The same thing with smartphones, and even with social media, depending on how costly it is to use more than one platform. And even some transaction shopping platforms like Amazon, there's really nothing to stop us from shopping on 100 different platforms. But if you join Amazon's club, the Prime Club, and you pay them whatever it is, $100 a year, and that gives you free delivery, you tend not to shop on other platforms because you don't want to pay twice for delivery, right? So there are different ways. It's just like airline free miles or other kinds of point benefits on travel platform sites like Expedia. So you want to discourage multi-homing and keep your users and complementers with you. So there's two other factors that we found in older conventional strategy. If there's a lot of differentiation or niche competition in your market, you're going to find the market is fragmented and you will not have one winner winning 50% or more of the market. And if you don't have high barriers to entry, you'll have continual competitors coming in, and they'll also erode market share and they'll erode the power of network effects. So these four factors kind of work together, but if they're working towards your advantage as a platform company, you can achieve 70, 90% market shares. And we've seen a couple dozen markets where that has taken place. By the way, it's not illegal to have a dominant market share. It's illegal in terms of antitrust law to abuse that market position. And human nature being what it is, we do tend to abuse things. In any case, we want to make users and complementers choose and choose, our platform if you're a platform company. Okay, so I can pause for a moment to check on some questions, and I do have another. Let me see. So how do you want to deal with questions?
If you want, Michael, I can. There's a few that I've been looking through, and some of them.
But if you want to summarize.
Yeah, sure. You provided a definition earlier of a platform, and so for example, what characteristics would be required to create a moat, and is there a need or an advantage to a moat?
I'm not exactly sure what we want to mean by the term moat, but you want to create entry barriers, I suppose. That might be the way of thinking about that. Or now there are ways to create those with technology, depending on the type of platform. Innovation platforms often have programming interfaces. So do some innovation side of transaction platforms like Facebook. So that's one way. Having APIs that are open but not open might be a way to control that. And also the APIs cannot necessarily be interoperable across platforms. So your APIs can be open, but you can build an application within, let's say, the Google Android environment, and it has to be ported to work on the iPhone, for example. So that's kind of a moat. So the APIs, even though they're open, are kind of a moat. You can have other kinds of ways of registering your users on one side or the other. But basically, the biggest defense, let's say, to these platforms is scale and usage. So it's not necessarily moats, because to a large extent, they're working in kind of open innovation or open access environments.
Okay. And so there's a lot of discussion revolves around tech. Let me join here. There we go. So what about some innovation platforms in non-technological industry? Some examples, like, for example, is there any analogous examples in cement, pulp, iron, steel?
So we get into some potential confusion between what is a platform or what is a key component. So
Sure.
for us, a platform has to be generating network effects. So there has to be some increasing value to users or complementers with more participation in the platform. So to some extent, you do have that with some of these other physical products. The example that I liked earliest was railroads. There was a time when railroads 150 years ago had their own gauges. Each railroad was a closed system in each city. And when they were opened up and made compatible, this was from a US government directive to standardize the gauge sizes. All the railroad platforms just expanded in usage, because you can go from Boston to Seattle, for example, and they encourage a lot of complementary investment along those railroads: telegraph, telephone, local transportation, investment banks. Let's say the least technology example that I've ever written about is the Barbie doll. And that's a case that the Barbie doll is $1 billion business of complementary accessories: clothing, toys, songbooks, little video games and chats. And the more of those you have, the more valuable that Barbie doll becomes, especially when users, let's say they're little girls, are actually exchanging clothes and toys. And so the more of those you have, the more valuable they become, the more ability to exchange or share. And so we have that type of phenomenon. It's more common with digital technologies, but if you look carefully, you can see it in many other cases. We also see it in some other areas that are not necessarily digital, but the way, again, the railroads is probably the greatest example. We could think about platformization of some types of chemicals. I've actually been looking now more recently at genetic engineering, even the coronavirus. The coronavirus is a kind of a platform. We don't need to reinvent vaccines from zero when we look at different types of viral infections. And I was actually asked to help our Center for Biomedical Innovation think about platformization in the pharmaceutical and drug discovery industries. So there are, and that's not necessarily digital, that's really biological. So there are many platforms and potential platforms as we look around.
And then, so open source models, could be an ideal model for successful platforms, but it seems that may not be the case all the time, or rarely. Do you agree or disagree, and explain why?
Well, the problem with a lot of open source business models is always, what is the business model? Where you're going to make money from? And so I've written about this in other books, The Business of Software, for example. So one way to think about it is you can give away certain technology or software applications and then make money on services, or have some additional complementary product. Let's say some installation utility or some software that's proprietary. So Red Hat has done this, for example, and IBM paid $33 billion to acquire Red Hat. Its basic platform is the Linux operating system, which is free and open source. But there's all sorts of other things that Red Hat has wrapped around that, including technical service, but installation and update utilities, some other proprietary software, consulting on how to use Linux and for other applications, substituting for other operating systems. So there are ways, but it's harder, and I don't think we see too many pure open source technology companies doing as well as those that have some mix of open and closed. And again, it's the Apple is maybe the best example, but you really need to have some control over your technology to really exploit it.
Okay. Let me do one more, and then we'll continue with your presentation. So, do you think an AI solution could become a platform?
So we look carefully at AI. We have a couple sections in the book on AI. So AI by itself is not really a platform. We think of it as an enabling technology. Blockchain is also an enabling technology. So we really see AI in almost everything, but there are different architectures to AI. So we also write about quantum computing, and there are different architectures there. So to the extent that you build, or people are building libraries and development tools associated with a particular AI architecture, for example, Google TensorFlow, then that does become a kind of an innovation platform. IBM has been trying to turn Watson into its own development platform, for example, around healthcare and other services. And so the applications there are kind of stuck to the development environment. And I don't mean stuck necessarily in a bad way. There's a stickiness of those APIs. So in some ways, those technologies could become like operating systems for development, but it's not the AI itself. It's kind of a higher level than that. You need something that looks like an operating system, whether it's an Internet of Things operating system or something for smartphones. Otherwise, we think of these as enabling technologies, but there are network effects associated as well. The more libraries and development tools you have around one of these architectures, the more useful it becomes, the more widely used it becomes. So they're kind of platforms. They're somewhere in between innovation platforms and enabling technologies. If I have any time left at the end, I'll say a few more things about that.
All right. Well, let's continue then, and we'll see what other questions we can tackle at the end.
Yeah, for all of these technologies, there's a few steps that companies need to go through. And so one of the first decisions is whether you're going to try an innovation platform or a transaction platform. It pretty much is difficult to start an innovation platform from scratch, but when you're designing your product, you may design that with opening it up to third-party complementers in some shape or form. Transaction platforms, we find those launched as businesses frequently from day one, as a kind of a marketplace, for example. And hybrid is a step that companies can take once they've launched one of the two platforms. But there's generally 4 steps involved. First, you need to figure out which market sides you're trying to bring together. Second, how are you going to solve that chicken or egg problem and really start populating one side that pulls in another side. And 3, you need to design your business model. You need to figure out how you're going to make money. A lot of these companies that we see around us, all around us today, they've kind of solved the chicken or egg problem, but they haven't figured out how to make money yet. Uber is one of those examples. And then if you get to this stage, you need to worry about ecosystem rules. And part of this is avoiding or figuring out how to work with regulators as regulators step in to try to control some of these businesses. It's not always clear which market side is most important, and it's very easy for entrepreneurs to make mistakes. In the case of Facebook, for example, we can think of this as a 4-sided platform. Started out with users, and of course Zuckerberg realized immediately that he couldn't have a platform without users, and so he made access to the platform free. Now, he could have charged a little bit of money, could have thought of Facebook as an online social platform or an online photo book for universities and charged for it. But he didn't do that. He let this side grow and then very quickly started selling advertisements. And this is, again, an indirect network effect between the users and advertisers. Then he opened it up from 2007 as a development platform. Facebook started around 2004. Opening up the APIs, the more applications and games and things you can do on the platform, the more time users spend, the more data you have on the users. All of that is accessible and interesting to advertisers. And of course, they use artificial intelligence and machine learning technology increasingly to match advertisers with users and with very targeted advertisements. And then, of course, they brought in digital platform partners, which again helps people stay on the platform and reveals lots about their preferences. So that's one example. But again, Facebook could easily have failed by just trying to charge for access or not having the kinds of controls over privacy that some prior social media platforms didn't have. Facebook was like the number 20 or 25 social media platform. MySpace was the one that it really displaced. So being first in this business is not necessarily most important. Most of the first movers actually failed. If we look at Android as an innovation platform, now, of course, users are very important. Applications are very important. In the PC industry, applications really determine who won and who lost. Steve Jobs really failed to build up an applications ecosystem. Bill Gates started doing it from day one with DOS, long before Windows. And so he easily got 90 to 95% of the PC market. When it came to smartphones, Microsoft thought they could follow the same path, but they didn't have a good product. And so that was a problem. iPhone was a better product. Android group basically copied that product. Android opened up access to its software, which was in many ways imitating the iOS software. And it formed the Open Handset Alliance. And so it said to basically everyone who was not Apple, here you go, here's a bunch of software. You guys fight it out making the handsets, but the software is free. Just sign on to use some of our Google services for search and also for advertising. And Google monetized it that way. So here, lining up those 30 or so handset makers that were all behind the curve once the iPhone came out in 2007 was a great strategy from Google. And of course, it monetized it with search. Airbnb, for example, listings is the most important part of this platform that draws in the other markets. So the founders essentially made a list of people that had rooms to rent, and then they started looking for users, and then they brought in B2B and B2C partners. These are kind of innovation platform extensions to a transaction platform. The B2B partners for insurance and cleaning and photography made it easier for listings to come in. More listings you had, the more users you had, the more users, the more listings. And then they also brought in B2C partners, which offer some of the same services that you might find in an integrated hotel. But Airbnb kind of disintegrates that market, but it can use the platform to bring those same services to its users. And then you have Uber, of course. You can have drivers without riders, but you can't have riders without drivers. And so Uber has been spending a fortune to build up the driver side, hoping to pull in riders. And it's also been bringing in partners. So let me get to another problem here. And I'm going to call this platform mania. And basically, this is how we term it in the book, that platformizing a bad business does not make it a good business. And here I think a lot of entrepreneurs and investors have made mistakes here. So creating a platform around something like ride sharing or grocery shopping and delivery does not generate the same profits as selling digital goods. And a transaction fee like Amazon creates from matching buyers with sellers is essentially a digital good, or selling software is a digital good, or Facebook is essentially selling digital goods. So platforms work when they solve a demand-supply imbalance, or they use digital technology to achieve new scale and scope economies that are not possible in the physical world. But if the platform is based on subsidies, either paying money or charging below market prices to one or two sides, and it does that continually, then it's not solved the chicken or egg problem. And then the danger is that the bigger the platform gets, the more money it loses. And we also find this in a lot of platforms. And these are part of the business model challenges and why so many of these companies need venture capital to just survive. large subsidies to two market sides. Uber, for example, which charges below market prices to riders, the market price is the taxi price, and it makes payments to drivers whether or not they're driving. So they don't only receive a commission. Sometimes there are weak or no network effects. Multi-homing is not costly. You know, nothing stops me from using, if I'm an Uber rider, a Lyft or a regular taxi or the local transportation, or even driving my own car, or Airbnb, having to compete with hotels. Sometimes the scale economies are very weak or they're very local. So, you know, Uber adding drivers in San Francisco doesn't necessarily help me if I'm in New York. Then there's competition, regulation, change in mood, and some cases you need a winner-take-all or most outcome to be able to raise prices or end subsidies. And you know, that's not so likely. Now, I will say in fairness to Uber, they've actually won most of the market in the US, and they have been raising prices, and that's been helping them a bit, but I'll get to Uber in a moment. So we have lots of these platforms out there. This is the bicycle graveyard in China, where companies just basically are reselling access to bicycles that they own at less than the cost of them owning them. And it's just a terrible business model. And I think people thought there was some digital element to this business because the onboarding would be digital through a smartphone, but it's just a disastrous rental business. It's not really, it's a company platform, but there's no market sides being matched here or network effects. The company owns the bicycles. Softbank founder Masayoshi Son has made, I think, a lot of mistakes jumping into a lot of digital businesses. Or businesses that he thought were digital but are really physical, like WeWork. This is also just re-renting access to a shared office space. And in many cases, they rent it out. In most cases, they rent it out below what it costs them to rent and renovate these properties. And because the onboarding is digital, I think he thinks it's a digital process, but there are really no network effects there. These are traditional product businesses or service businesses. They're not multi-sided platforms. There are no network effects. And they're just like standalone rental companies. And generally, they're selling their services below cost. So no surprise that they lose so much money. All right, and Airbnb versus Uber is an interesting comparison. So Uber's been they lose about $1 billion a quarter or more because of the subsidies. And again, they need to pay the commission and fixed payments to drivers, even if they're not driving. And they had a terrible time before their IPO. They were losing about 12.5% of their drivers each month. It cost them about $650 to hire each driver. At that time, they had 3 million drivers, so you can do the calculations yourself. They were spending $3 billion a year just to replace their drivers. And that's a problem, a structural problem they have to fix. And because they're subsidizing those two sides, whereas Airbnb does not subsidize either side, they charge both sides. They charge the market rates. The renters decide what they want to rent for. There's no subsidy of supply or demand. But even Airbnb, with competition from hotels, and nowadays with no one traveling and spending money on hotel rooms or Airbnb rooms, they're really in trouble. But they started to lose money because of their attempt to get bigger before their IPO. So it's very easy to lose a lot of money with these platforms. So the bottom line, some business advice: you really do need to start with a good product or service that is a viable business to begin with. Just platformizing it is not going to make you money unless there's some new savings or scale economies you can generate with digital technology, but that's pretty elusive. Now, if you have a product, think about complementing it with an innovation platform. You know, there's no way Apple could have paid for the millions of programmers that develop applications. Same thing with Windows, same thing with Google Android. And you may decide you can make a lot more money more easily with a transaction platform, just linking providers with people that want access to that service or those assets. That's a transaction platform. Or think creatively about how you can combine the two. But platforms, like in any other business, they really need to be addressing some demand-supply imbalance or creating demand in some shape or form. There needs to be some kind of market failure that the platform's addressing. You need to figure out what is the most important side, and that side has to be essentially free. You can't start charging the side that you need to to build your platform and attract the other side. And then the key point here is after launch, you want to grow through network effects, not with below cost prices and two-sided subsidies, because if that's your business model, the bigger you get, the more money you're going to lose. Okay, so just a final couple comments here. So we're going to see more of these platforms in the future, and we think there's three big trends. Most companies now, if they build an innovation platform or a transaction platform, they're going to try to combine them in some way. So we see more hybrids, more enabling technologies, and network effects really drive us to fewer and bigger platforms, and that's just the reality. So all across these different areas, and some of the areas that we write about in the book are self-driving cars, voice-activated smart devices and applications, biotechnology, CRISPR as a gene editing type of platform. And again, this technology can be used in many other applications. And also quantum computing. It's an area I've been following for 15 years or so. So we make some distinction between platforms and enabling technologies, okay? Even though they're very closely connected. All right, so let me stop here. That is my last slide.
Okay, excellent.
And we can go to some more questions.
Sure. So here's a question on a business, on running a business where you have the challenges, you know, of prioritizing platform development versus the day-to-day business that needs to generate revenue, right, in the short term. So any recommendations for this type of challenge?
Yeah, it's a really big challenge. So in a class that I teach, I teach a case on Intuit with, they have their accounting software, QuickBooks. And that was the biggest challenge for them, because so they could spend a little money building a feature and they kind of know what the return is on that investment. Whereas trying to open your APIs and expect the world to produce those features for you just through the natural ecosystem is a much bigger bet. Again, though, if you can get that going. So, you know, I would advise people to allocate some money and some time to the ecosystem kind of strategy, because in the long run, depending on what you're doing, and we have some metrics to think about that. So if you're building a product where you really can control all of the innovation internally, then maybe you don't need to go outside. Just focus it internally. But some markets become platformized, and they are depending on innovations outside your capabilities or beyond your ability to invest in. And so that's where, whether you like it or not, you might have to follow a platform strategy, particularly if some of your competitors are doing it. The transaction platform is a different kind of animal. It's a different type of decision.
Okay, and so then what are some of the early signs that a market might be platformizing or about to platformize?
Well, if no competitors are doing it, then you don't see any platform. But if someone has started it, so in banking, for example, and this gets a little bit into a non-pure IT, we're increasingly finding that some companies or entrepreneurs have formed digital banks, and they're very limited as to what they'll offer, but they have a customer base. So they might want to offer larger loans or mortgage loans or credit cards. Or some other kinds of accounting software for small and medium-sized businesses. So all those kinds of products and services could be offered to your customers through a platform strategy, right? And but if no one's doing it and everyone is operating in a traditional way, I guess there's no pressure on you to do it. But if someone starts to do it and you don't do it, then you're behind. You don't have the ability to offer those products and services to your customers at the same level of cost as someone who does it through a successful platform. But it does take time. It generally can take 3 to 5 years to build up enough of an ecosystem where it's really enhancing your product. But as I said, there are some companies that just start off with a marketplace from day one. And then their problem is, how do they get enough of the supply side to attract the demand side, and how do they get enough demand side to attract the supply side? And there are different strategies you can deploy for that. We only have, you know, an hour for this today, so I can only throw out a few ideas.
Yeah, sure. And so to the chicken and egg conundrum and the solving a problem, there's the issue of extra considerations for startups or corporates in countries with much smaller populations, right? And consequently much smaller business environments. So what do they need to take into account into building a platform, and how do they reach critical mass for adoption? Like if you're not starting in the US, China, the EU.
So we find a lot of local platforms. So not necessarily, you don't have to be the scale of Amazon or Google to have a successful platform. So I have some students. I actually just gave a seminar last week for a company called Ajua, which is in Nigeria. So we have local platforms. You do need some population, but sometimes the platforms can be very specialized, and they may just have a few hundred users or customers. And it's just a different way of providing access to products and services. So if you look carefully, you'll find a lot of local and regional platforms. And you also will find global platforms like Amazon deciding maybe we want to be in the African market, or we want to be in India. And so they will go in, they will try to get in. They will often have barriers. There's a local platform there already. You know, Walmart went into India. They have access to companies like Flipkart, which they purchased, or Amazon has made other acquisitions. So we find platforms everywhere. We don't hear about them unless they become these global public behemoths, right? That attract the attention of regulators.
Mm-hmm. And then manufacturers like, Moderna, which we're familiar with at MIT very much so, and Audi, BMW, they plan to use 5G and AI to create a platform, like extended chains. What are your thoughts on that 5G AI as far as platforms?
So again, those are not platforms; those are enabling technologies.
Okay.
But for example, we do need some platformization of self-driving technology. We need vehicles to communicate with each other, just like aircraft communicate or are supposed to communicate with each other, so you know where they are, right? Also, all the self-driving cars generally they need machine learning algorithms, and they need data for those algorithms to work. So if there was a way to share data, so we do write a little bit about that, and I have another separate study of that. So what we see in the self-driving area, we find some core technologies are being created, like with Mobileye with cameras, and then there's some software around that to process different data inputs from LiDAR as well as camera sensors and even sonar sound. So we are seeing some platformization of the software to process the data from these different sensors. And then again, the machine learning algorithms as you have more and more usage of these. So if we had more sharing, if we did have more of an open platform, we would make progress faster. But companies are basically digging in and saying, I have a better solution than you do. So what we see is partnerships, and there's a few of them forming where a number of auto companies figure out they can't develop all this technology themselves, so they partner with one or two other companies. There's some key suppliers that are supplying almost all of these companies, though, the underlying suppliers. So it's not quite at the platform level yet, but that's again an example of an industry where we think platformization makes a lot of sense. They're all using artificial intelligence and machine learning. Which algorithms are they using, et cetera? Those are some different kinds of technology choices. But the data and access to that data is the real platform issue, and communications across the different machines.
Very good. All right. Well, I think that's about all the time we've got. But we have posted your book in the intro time, and also it was put in the chat. And any other resource that you might point to for people interested in looking to this a little further?
Well, I write little pieces in communication with the ACM periodically. Okay. But this is an ongoing area of research, and we are looking at all the new technologies that could be platformized.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was wonderful. So again, if any of you have any questions about Michael's work, MIT Corporate Relations, which includes the Industrial Liaison Program, the MIT Startup Exchange, you may reach out to us at our website, ilp.mit.edu. And we thank you all for joining us today. We will continue this Innovations in Management series next week, Thursday, May 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Presentations by Imran Saeed. and Stephanie Werner. And thank you again from us at MIT Corporate Relations. We wish you the best for your health and safety, and goodbye.